Hello, and welcome to the lectures for chapters 11 through 13. We're going to begin with chapter 11, which is over sculpture. Sculpture is artwork that is meant to be seen from all sides. We also call this in the round or freestanding sculpture. The first type of sculpture that we're going to talk about is modeling, but we'll also look at carving, assembling, and casting. Modeling is an additive process in which the artist manipulates the materials. It can be done with tools or fingers, and the marks are often going to be present in a work. We can see that in this piece, Female Dignitary, Mayan piece, made out of clay from 600 to 900 CE. You can actually see some of the tool marks left behind as the artist has worked in clay. Robert Arneson also used modeling in his work. He used an armature, which is a rigid inner support used to prevent sagging. And he looked at all his artwork as a self-portrait, and this one is more literal than some of his, being a self-portrait of the artist. Marilyn Levine sculpts with clay as well. She makes portraits of people through objects. This is Bob's jacket, and it is ceramic. It looks like it's leather, but it's actually made out of clay. And the next process we're going to talk about is casting. Casting is the process in which the liquid material is poured into a mold that was taken from an original. It is an indirect process, which means the artist is separated from the final result by at least one step. When we're talking about smaller pieces, we're often talking about the lost wax process. In this case, what will happen is the artist will create an original from wax, then they'll make a mold of that, perhaps in plaster or some other material. Then they'll pour a molten hot liquid metal into it, and the metal will burn the wax away, filling in the void that was there. And then you remove the mold and you have your metal sculpture left. This is a larger piece, The Burghers of Calais by Rodin from 1884. Each one of these was done in a casting process, but originally modeled out of clay and then created a mold from it and then cast it in bronze. Carving is a process in which the artist begins with a block of material and then chips it away. It's going to be more aggressive than modeling and more direct than casting. Usually material and then chips away at it. It can be done with materials like wood or stone. The artist must work directly with the material, so it's a more direct method than casting, and it's going to be more aggressive than modeling. The piece that we're looking at here is an Egyptian piece from 3100 BCE called the Palette of Narmer. And this is a low, or what we call a bas relief, in which the sculpture is not freestanding but projects from the background of the surface. So we can see just a slight raised edge of the figure and that small shadow that's created around the figures. That's how the figures are standing out from the background. So basically the background is going to be carved away and the figures are going to be left to stick out. Another example of low relief is coins. Even the coins that we use today are low relief. Then we have a deeper relief or a high relief. This is where more than 1/2 the natural circumference of the model form projects from the background. So we can see the difference between this and the Palette of Narmer, in which we can see a lot more deeper shadows. You can almost imagine that this leg is carved in the round. These figures are sticking so far off the background that even part of their leg may be carved in the round. So you see a lot more light and shadow with the high relief. And then we have sculpture in the round, and that is where you can walk around the sculpture, and it has been carved out of stone. This is Colossal Head from the Olmec culture from 1500 BCE. In this particular sculpture, you can actually see the original shape of the material, and the artist has kind of carved away and left some of the planes on the same level. You can kind of see here the front of the rock is all the same level. So these particular heads were done in such a way that you're not going to see a complete release from the original form of the material. It was a very hard stone, and that's part of the reason why we see that shape of the stone the original stone kept. Michelangelo's preferred method was carving out of stone. And this is his Awakening Slave from 1530 to 1534. He thought that sculpture was the process of releasing a form from within a block of stone. In this case, we can still actually see the chisel marks of the artist as he's starting to release this figure from the stone. Assemblage is a process in which individual pieces are brought together to form a work. So you might have disparate parts that are then brought together. This became popular in the early 20th century, and these works are called constructions or assemblages. This is Bull's Head by Picasso from 1943. He was known for assembling found objects so that we could change the way that we see the objects. So here we can see a bicycle seat and handlebars, and the way he's put it together makes it look like a bull's head. So trying to make us see things in a new way. Cubist by David Smith from 1963. It's made out of stainless steel. So we have these parts that were made separately, but then attached together. So the steel is a modern material, so this is much more modern. And then the geometry of the pieces are going to contrast with the organic grindings on the surface. And then we have installation. Installation is going to change the environment with the artwork, and these can be seen as far back as 1070. This is Serpent Mound in Ohio. It's a Native American earthwork. The artists are unknown, and the purpose is unknown, but you can see that they've taken the earth and created a sculpture on the ground that really can only be seen from above. In a more modern piece, this is The Gates by Christo and Jean-Claude from 1979 all the way to 2005. It took that long to be able to create this piece. It took that much planning. So I already said that the installation is the process in which the artist changes an environment, and it can be indoor or outdoor with the work. In this case, there was hundreds of these gates set up, and these gates are very tall. You can actually walk underneath them. It lasted 16 days, and then it was dismantled. So the planning period was from 1979 to 2005, and then it was just 16 days that it was allowed to stand in the park. And the viewer really became involved. You can see heads of people right here as they're going through the sculpture. This is The Weather Project by Olafur Eliasson from 2003. He installed it in a huge atrium that was nearly 500 feet long. He's created a huge semicircular sun of bright lamps, but then covered the ceiling with mirrors to create the illusion of the entire circle. It creates an intense yellow glow in the hall, and then there's dry ice at the bottom that kind of creates a mist. So you can imagine he's bringing the outside inside with this piece. So moving on to the next chapter, the arts of ritual and daily life. In the Middle Ages, that was the last period in which art and craft were considered to be the same thing. In the Renaissance, objects with a function began to be seen as a lower art form and began to be labeled as craft. But the 20th century, we see a change in attitude towards craft, particularly with the Bauhaus school, in which form and function became united in the pieces that were created. And it was a union of art academy and a craft workshop. And this change that happened in the early 20th century has brought Western thought more in line with that of the rest of the world, actually. So this is Jar by Maria Martinez from 1939. And so we're seeing an extraordinary version of a pot in which she has given us a design. The way that she creates her pieces is that she hand builds her pieces out of local clay, and then she uses a process of burnishing. So she'll put slip on the piece and then she'll burnish it to make it really shiny. And then she fires it where the smoke can then get absorbed into the clay. And where it's shiny, that's where she's burnished it. And where it's not shiny, that's where she's not burnished it. Peter Volkos is an artist from the mid-1950s that brought ceramics tradition together with modern art expression. He moved craft more towards art. So a lot of the times he would be dealing with the same form of a vessel that we see a lot of clay artists create, but he's going to combine that with the emotional imagery of abstract expressionism, which we'll talk about in the art history section of our course. Glass is a material where the principal ingredients are silica and sand. When molten, it can be shaped, so it has to be melted for it to be worked with. It's extremely fragile. We can see it worked with in medieval architecture in the form of stained glass. And the character of the material really determines the character of the expression. This is Persian Chandelier by Chihuly from 2005. When you all go to the Oklahoma City Museum, you may be able to see a Chihuly in person. Then we have metal. Metal is a durable, strong, and formable material. The type of method used in metal working is called forging or blacksmithing. It's where you heat the material and then shape it. So in this case, we actually can see several different ways of forging. One is embossing, where you're hammering the images from behind the surface. Then we have chasing, where outlines are added by chisels. And damascene, which is places that have been inlaid with gold. So the embossing, you can see the image been hammered out from behind. Then the chasing, the lines have been hammered back in from the surface, and then you see the inlaid areas as well with the different material. And filigree car bombing by Cal Lane from 2007. He's combining the intricate metalwork with scenes from today. He had an affinity for lace making, which is traditionally a female art form. So he began to feminize pieces of metal by creating lacy surfaces and sheets of metal. Wood is a material that is easy to work with, widely available, but it is not going to be as durable as some of the other materials that we've looked at. What's unique about wood is that the growth characteristics of individual trees will remain in the wood. This is Crosswinds by Virginia Dotson, in which she's straddling the boundary between useful things and objects just for contemplation. She's using two kinds of wood that have been inlaid, laminated, and then lathed. The furniture is going to be the most common product of wood. This is another Egyptian piece in which we're seeing a portable chair that's been carved. You can see the feet have been carved in feline-like form, and then we have papyrus plants on the side here. So a lot of detail went into this extraordinary chair. And then lastly, in our arts of ritual and daily life is fiber. Fiber is where you're taking narrow strands of vegetable or animal materials such as cotton, linen, wool, and silk, and then using those to create your object. It's going to be widely available, and it's also going to be perishable. So although like wood, it's widely available, it's just not going to be as sturdy as other materials like clay or metal. Some techniques include weaving, stitching, basketry, surface design, wearable art, and handmade paper making. Weaving is where interlacing fibers are set at right angles Tapestry is where you're going to see yarns manipulated to produce imagery. And quilting is sewing pieces of fabric together, which is usually, or could be, traditionally a social activity. The piece we're looking at here is a quilt. It's called Bible Quilt by Harriet Powers from 1898, and it actually survives from slave times. She was an African-American artist, and this was not a group effort, so she did this all on her own. She used a technique called applique, in which colored fabrics are sewn onto a fabric background. She's illustrating Bible scenes as well as local lore showing God's workings in this piece. And then lastly, I just wanted to tie all these together with Dinner Party by Judy Chicago from 1979. In it, she's using metal, clay, and fiber to create an installation art sculpture piece. You can see the clay being used in the place settings as well as all the tile on the inside. The tile all have names of important females throughout history. Each one of these place settings is done for an important female in history and designed specifically for her. Then you have metal work with the chalices and the flatware. And then, of course, you have the fiber work with the tablecloths surrounding the large triangular table. So that's going to lead us into chapter 13, which is all about architecture. In architecture, you're going to see 3 issues that are used to satisfy the basic human need for shelter. Function, which is how it works. Form, which is how it looks. And structure, which is how it stands up. Some of the different structural systems that we'll look at are that they explain the structure of a work. And one is called shell, where one material forms the structural support and the outer material, or outer protection. So it's just one cohesive shell of the building. And then you have skeleton and skin, where you have a rigid interior skeleton for support and then an outer sheathing for the skin. For the shell system, you're going to see materials like wood, brick, stone, and adobe being used. And then it's also been revived in contemporary times because of more strong materials like plastics being used. And then for skeleton and skin, you'll see things like a wood skeleton and then like a stone sheathing, for example. So there's 2 factors that we have to consider when choosing the structural system and materials. One is the weight. All the weight of the materials must be carried down to the ground somehow. And the other is tensile strength, which is the ability of a material to span horizontal distances. So the first type of construction that we're going to talk about is load-bearing construction. And this is basically stacking and piling. It's the simplest method of construction. Stacking materials include brick, stone, and adobe, and usually get thinner as the building gets taller, so that as you get taller, you're lessening the load. This is a stable type of construction because the weight diminishes as you go higher. So it's almost like a triangle where you're going to have the largest at the bottom and then smaller at the top. But this kind of construction does not allow for large open windows, so you're going to see few and small openings. So this is the Great Friday Mosque from the Genet culture from the 13th century onward. It is a spectacular example made of adobe, which is sun-dried brick, and it's very and it has tapered walls, which you can see up at the top here. You can see how it gets skinnier as you go up. You can see the poles sticking out. These are actually used as scaffolding as the, I think it's every 5 years they have to reapply mud to the structure so that it will remain. This is the Great Zimbabwe interior. It's from before 1450. It's created out of masonry, which is stacking stones in a consistent pattern. It is 15 feet thick at the base for stability. Originally, it had roofing made of grass and thatch, but it has no windows as that would have weakened the masonry walls. Moving on, we're going to talk about post and lintel construction, which is the next elemental step from just stacking. In post and lintel construction, it's going to be based on 2 uprights, which are the posts, and then 1 horizontal, which is the lintel. You can see that the weight of the lintel is going to be carried down to the ground by the posts. And you have to consider the compression and tension of the material. So you can imagine, for example, how far apart you could put wood versus stone. It's going to be a smaller distance for stone because it is a heavier material. So it will have more compression and tension and will pull down harder in the middle. So you can't go as far apart when you're using stone as you could with wood, for example. Hopefully that makes sense. One of the first cultures to use post and lintel construction was the Egyptians. And in this one, we can see the posts are made out of these columns that were made to look like papyrus stalks. And then you can see the lintels here and see how kind of short they are as compared to the posts. That's because it is made out of stone. And so you're going to see a lot of columns and not as kind of much space that's going to be created by the lintels. This is called a forest of columns or a hypostyle hall, which is Greek for beneath the columns. So it's a space that's created by, hundreds of columns. So when you walk in, you're just going to be surrounded by columns. In Greece, the post and lintel construction became standardized within temples. And there were 3 major architectural units or orders that are defined by the columns or the posts. The first is Doric from the 7th century. The second is Ionic from the 6th century BCE. And the third is the Corinthian from the 4th century BCE. And the Doric is 7th century BCE. So these are some of the different columns. You can see the Doric, Ionic, and then Corinthian. Doric is going to be known for its simple design. It has a simple flared capital, where Ionic is going to have these scrolls, and then Corinthian has the acanthus leaves. So that's the major difference between the 3 orders, but you can see they also get taller and skinnier as you go on in styles. This is the temple of Athena Nike, which is an Ionic temple. You can see it has some of it remaining. So it has the columns across the front. And then up above, we're going to have the entablature, which is created out of the architrave and the frieze. And then up above that, you see the cornice. Well, you can see a little bit of the cornice, which is the corners here. And then the pediment would have been originally a triangular form. And we'll look at a diagram where you can see that a little bit better. You don't have to have all of these words memorized or anything, but the architrave is going to be what's right above the columns. And then the frieze is going to be the carved in either triglyphs or it will have a scene like this. The cornice is going to be up above and includes the corner here. And then the pediment, you can see, would continue on to create a triangular shape up above. These elements were actually passed down and can still be seen in modern architecture. So moving on to the round arch and vault. The round arch was perfected by the Romans in the 2nd century BCE. And it implements the principles of tension and compression, kind of like when you can imagine doing like a back bend, how your arms and your legs would support the weight of your back. That's how a arch works. Some of the virtues of using rounded arches is that it opens up space. It's also an attractive form. It can emit more light and reduce wall weight and lowers the amount of material needed. The Roman arch perfected, there's a perfect semicircle, and the arch is supported by the keystone, which is the very top stone of the arch. You can imagine without that, the whole thing would just collapse in on itself. You're also going to see, you're going to need outward support here. So like a wall would be needed here. You can't just have a freestanding arch because of the outward thrust of the arch. You can imagine there's putting pressure here, and it's going to want to flow this way. So you have to have a wall to kind of reinforce the legs of the arch. Here's a great example of some of these rounded arches. It's a series of arches that are supported by columns, which is called an arcade. This is Pont du Gard. It's actually an aqueduct, or the upper is an aqueduct and the lower is a footbridge. It's still intact after 2,000 years, and you can see how the arches are right on top of each other, and then up above you'll see kind of 3 arches per one of the larger arches below. So it's done in this very kind of mathematical way to create a very pleasing aspect when you look at it. Then we have the rounded arch and vault. Then we have the rounded vault. Which is called a barrel vault. This is when an arch is just extended in depth, and it's going to enable architects to create larger interior spaces. You're not going to have them full of columns, for example. This is Sainte Foy, the interior of Sainte Foy from the Romanesque time period, 1050 to 1200. Was when the Romanesque time period was. What we're looking at is the nave, which is the long central area of the cathedral, and it's covered by a barrel vault. So you can see the rounded arch here, but then you can see how it just continues on into space. And then you can see at the crossing here, which is the crossing between the nave and the transept, you're actually going to get what we call a groin vault, which is an intersection between 2 barrel vaults, and I'll show you a diagram of that in just a second. So that's what a barrel vault looks like, and then this is what a groin vault looks like. And you can see how all the weight coming from the middle is going to be thrust outward and then down into the pillars. Then we have the pointed arch and vault. The rounded arch was limited in that it had to be a semicircle, so it had to have the same height and width. And the weight was an outward thrust that was only contained by walls, so you're going to have thick and heavy walls because of that. And because of the thick and heavy walls, you're not going to be able to have huge windows, so it's going to be more dark. And so they developed in the Gothic time period the pointed arch, which channels weight downward better, so it can be taller, and you don't have to have heavy walls to reinforce it. Instead, they're going to be using what we call our ribs, which are reinforcement along points of intersections. So let's look at a building that uses these pointed arches and vaults. This is Reims Cathedral, and you can see how much lighter and more open this feels. You can see the great big stained glass windows, and then windows along the side and up at the top here. You can see the pointed arch and how it continues into space. On the outside of Gothic cathedrals, you'll be able to see those buttresses a little bit better. So the buttresses are going to be the reinforcements you can see here, and then a flying buttress is where you kind of have this arch that's like supporting the top part of the building and then coming into those buttresses down below. Then we have the dome. A dome is just an arch, a rounded arch that's been rotated 360 degrees, and the outward thrust from this must be contained by walls of some sort. So here you can see a dome, and they're showing the little arrows there to show what the outward thrust would be like. One of the most famous examples of a Roman dome is the Pantheon, and it is a perfect hemisphere dome. It's been it's still standing. So it's been a couple thousand years. It's still there. You can see it's got this more kind of Greek looking temple on the front, and then it's got a rotunda, which is a rounded building behind it. And so that rounded building is supporting all that outward thrust of the dome. On the interior of the dome, you guys can see in this little diagram how it has these little squares. That is a coffered ceiling, which allows for the weight of the structure to become less and less as you go up. You can kind of see how it thins out towards the round opening of the Pantheon, which is the oculus. I think I have a shot of the interior, yeah, so you can see here the coffered ceilings. The Pantheon is made out of concrete, and the Romans were the ones who invented concrete. And it's a different type of concrete than that's used today. It's a little bit more brittle, but that's part of the reason that this has lasted so long. Then we have Hagia Sophia. And this building you can see is a square building. So we actually need a transition between the round dome and the square building. And you can see those here. These are called pendatives. They're triangular shaped forms that are going to ease that transition between the dome and then that square building. The minarets that you're seeing here, these towers, were actually added later when this was turned into a mosque. So here you can see a dome on pendatives. And then we have what we call a corbelled arch and dome, which is different than a rounded arch or a pointed arch. This was developed by indigenous Islamic architects, and it's where you have one row of stones that extends slightly over the one below it, and it's based more on the post and lintel structure rather than like this containing the outward thrust. So it's going to be quite different in how it's distributing the weight. You can see that here how each layer kind of projects out from the one below it as you're going up into the dome. Oh, I'm sorry. Here you can see what the corbelled arch looks like and how one stone kind of projects off the one below it. Okay, so then moving on to cast iron construction, which was developed in the 19th century. And it was developed due to the discovery of iron strength for building. We're going to look at the Crystal Palace, which was the first modern skin and skeleton building. The skin is, or the skeleton is cast iron, and then the skin is the glass that it's been sheathed in. It was made from prefabricated modules, and it was erected in only 16 weeks because of that prefabrication. It's interesting because this really doesn't have any borrowing from earlier styles, so it's kind of creating its own look. The Eiffel Tower is also cast iron construction, but it's just the skeleton. We don't have any skin on it, any sheathing. Then we have steel frame construction, which was one of the inventions that made the skyscraper possible. The other one was the elevator. So first you construct a steel cage that supports the entire building, and then a sheath is added to it. So along with the invention of elevators, steel frame construction is responsible for the first skyscrapers. Construct a steel cage and then add a sheathing, which is what they did with the Wainwright building. It's the first fully modern building. The fact that it has elevators in it. It's made out of steel, shade, and masonry. And you can see they borrowed from Roman pillars. So even on this modern building, you're still seeing some of that influence from classical times. Then we have suspension. This is when the weight of the structure is suspended by cables supported by vertical pylons driven into the ground. So all of this weight that's from the road here on the Golden Gate Bridge is brought up first and then brought up to these large pylons, and then those pylons are driven into the ground. So all that weight is gone, carried upward and then down back to the ground. So the weight of the structure is suspended by cables. The cables are supported by those vertical pylons. The weight travels up the cables to the pylons and then into the ground. And then the last material that we're going to talk about is reinforced concrete. Romans invented concrete as a construction material. It was a mixture of cement, gravel, and water. But it was not reinforced with anything. And in the 19th century, reinforced concrete became more popular. And what this is where you have concrete, but then it has something in it, usually embedded iron rods, to reinforce it. And this is going to improve its tensile strength and allow for more interesting structures. In the Sydney Opera House that we're looking at here, the walls and the roof are actually one, and it's just amazing to think about how they were able to create a structure like this that's standing upward out of concrete. So that is the end of chapters 11 through 13, and I will see you next time.